You talk about the new Great Depression. How would you define a Great Depression?
Well, it's a good question, and it's kind of points to the distinction between a depression and a recession, and they're two different things. Recession, people are familiar with, economists use the term all the time, and it has a numeric definition. It's 2 or more consecutive quarters of declining GDP. There are a couple other factors that go in, but that's the basic rule of thumb. So 2 consecutive quarters, 2 or more of declining GDP, that's a recession. And of course, we had a recession, at least in the United States, actually probably most of the world, in the first half of 2020. First quarter and second quarter were both down, and there's the recession. So the third quarter growth was quite strong. It didn't come all the way back compared to what was lost in the first half, but it was strong. And so that you could argue that the recession was over by July of 2020. We have a group in the United States called the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's a private group of economists, but they're the official scorekeepers, if you will, about recessions. They did declare a recession started in the first quarter. They haven't said it's over, but it's very likely that they'll reach that conclusion. A depression is different. Economists, first of all, don't like the word depression because it's more subjective. It's not as quantitative. It involves a lot of almost psychological, behavioral variables, if you will. But depressions are real. They happen, and we're in one now. But economists just don't like to talk about it. They've kind of banned the D word, as I put it, from the vocabulary. So a lot of people assume that if a recession is 2 quarters or more of declining GDP, and a depression sounds worse, that must be 10 quarters of declining GDP, some really horrible economic outcome. And that's not the definition. You can actually have growth in a depression, but the point is it's depressed growth. It's growth below trend, below potential. And for that matter, I think you could make a good case that we've been in a depression since 2008. You look at the recovery. Okay, we had a recovery from 2009 to 2019. It was the longest expansion in U.S. history, but it was also the weakest expansion in U.S. history. The average annual growth during that entire 10-year period was about 2.2%, whereas in all recoveries post 1980, the average recovery was 3.2%. So there's an example where you had growth, but it was a full percentage point below trend, below what we had done previously. If you go back even further to the end of World War II forward, average recoveries were closer to 4.5%. Yeah. So if that's the potential in a developed economy and you're growing at 2.2, that's depressed growth. We can leave the definition of what happened for those 10 years for another day. But now the point is we've had a technical recession. We may be approaching another technical recession, the first back-to-back recession since 1980. But that aside, we're in a period of depressed growth. We won't recover 2009 levels of output until late this year at the earliest, maybe probably early 2022. And this will persist for not just years, but for perhaps a decade or more. This will be intergenerational in its impact. So that's what I mean by depression. I did an interview the other day, and I said this, could be or appeared to be worse than the Great Depression. And the person I was interviewing with said, well, hold on, the Great Depression, they recited some statistics since it hasn't been that bad yet. I said, well, you're missing the point. Those figures from the Great Depression took 4 years to play out. We've only been, or in some ways 10 years, if you go all the way up to 1940, we've only been in this for about a year. So let's, call me next year, the year after, see where things stand. But in my view, we're in a new Great Depression. It will persist. Will have intergenerational effects and will be very, very difficult to get out of. Even periods of growth will be very weak growth.
Yeah, because I can imagine a lot of people think about high unemployment rate, for example, if they think about the Great Depression. And if you look at the unemployment rate, when we last spoke in April, it was sky high, around 15%. And then it went down all the way to around 6.3%. Of course, you can have a whole discussion about the definition of unemployment. In your book, you also describe the labor force participation rate, which has been declining over time. But just purely looking at the unemployment rate, it seems like we are in a much better state now, purely based on that number than we were when we
been dropping steadily since really since the late 1990s, but more steeply since 2008. Fell off a cliff in 2020, but it's dropped over 10 years or so from the high 60s to the low 60s. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot. You're talking about almost 10% of a workforce of 120 million people. So this is 12 million people or so who don't have jobs. But we're not talking just about, early retirees or baby boomers or, teenagers or others. These are basically able-bodied people between the ages of 25 and 54, prime working age. There are over 10 million of them who don't have jobs, but they're not counted as unemployed because they're not looking for jobs. But the point I make is, well, if you're a bartender in a town where every bar is closed, what's the point of looking for a job? Maybe you can move to Phoenix, Arizona and put solar panels together, but that's not very likely. The point is, and that labor force participation rate never gets to 100%. It never gets over 70%. There are good reasons for some people not to have jobs. You could be a student, you could be a homemaker. As I said, there are other reasons. But when it drops that much, you have a large pool. And by the way, I've been speaking of this for a long time. Other analysts have as well. Jay Powell, chairman of the Fed, mentioned it in a speech last week. So it's even beginning to sink in at the Fed a little bit. And he said what we're saying right now, which is if you take the able-bodied Americans who don't have jobs but not looking for them and add them to the unemployed list, that percentage number goes up to about 12 or 15%, and that is a depression level unemployment rate.
Yeah. We met once in New York around 10 years ago, and we set up an interview between you and James Turk. That was in 2011. I visited New York a few times afterwards, and I really love spending time there, but I haven't been there now in many years. How would you describe the situation there now is there still talk of a lockdown, or are bars opening up again? Could you describe a little bit the setting of New York at the moment?
Yeah, it's more lockdown than not. And this is, by the way, the evidence is overwhelming from many studies, both international and comparing states in the United States, that lockdowns do not work to stop the spread of the virus. They're very good at destroying economies. They don't stop the spread of the virus. We've seen, for example, in the United States, we have 50 states. Well, we never had a national lockdown. It went state by state, governor by governor, in some cases mayor by mayor. So we have a pretty good, we have a diverse set of experiences. So there are places like California and New York that had extreme lockdowns. You had a place like Florida, which had more of a moderate lockdown. You have a state like South Dakota, which had no lockdown. The governor said, wash your hands, social distance. If you don't want to go out to a restaurant, that's fine, but we're not going to tell you can't. We'll make it voluntary. The same thing was true around the world. We saw extreme lockdowns in Italy and Spain and France in the first wave in 2020. We had some countries that did moderate lockdowns. I would put Sweden in that category. And some countries that, at least initially, had no lockdowns. And Brazil is an example of that. So we now have the data. We have the 50 states. We have 30 or more countries around the world. And what the data shows clearly is that there is no correlation between lockdown policy and the spread of the disease. Or put in more statistical terms, the lockdown policy has no material impact on the spread of the virus. Whatever policy you pursue, you get pretty much the same results in terms of caseloads and fatalities. I did another interview earlier today. It was a large international audience, a lot of people from Asia, and one question said, New Zealand had a very severe lockdown and the spread of the disease declined. And couldn't the United States learn from New Zealand? I said, no. I said, I don't doubt that you had a lockdown. I know you had a lockdown. I know the disease declined, but it would have declined anyway. And that's really the point. And we see that from a lot of the data. So lockdowns don't help, but they do destroy economies. And that's what we've seen in New York. Now, they say they're easing up, but let's define that. So restaurants can have indoor seating, but only at 25% of capacity. Sports arenas can have fans in the seats, but only at 10% of capacity, and only if you bring a recent test result with you, like a little QR code on your iPhone, etc. That's tantamount to a lockdown. They say they're easing up, but they're not really easing up. The impact on the economy is devastating, and it's not just a question of a business shutting down and then reopening, 6 weeks later, 8 weeks later. A lot of these businesses don't survive. Perhaps half of small businesses are going out of business permanently. Those job losses are not temporary, they're permanent. The owners of, let's say a restaurant or bar, salon, boutique shop, they're closing their doors, breaking their leases, selling their equipment at bargain basement prices, and the workers are never getting their jobs back. Now, eventually those people will get jobs, and perhaps the restaurant owner will move to a different state, move to Florida, and open a new restaurant next year. I'm not saying it's the end of the world, but I'm saying it's the end of millions of small businesses, and that's about half the economy in the U.S. So New York, streets are pretty much abandoned. Murder rate has doubled. Crime in the subway is, people are afraid to walk into the subways. Tax base is eroded. There's graffiti everywhere. Stores are still boarded up, some of them. And the city's depopulating. We, in the United States, when you move, I suppose it's true in other countries around the world,